largo, entonces si se cansan, si se cansan o si tienen otra cosa que hacer, entendemos perfectamente y por eso estamos grabando. Entonces, por favor, no piensen que tengan que pasar todo el día delante de la pantalla. Es muy malo para la vista y malo en muchos sentidos. Sobre todo hay una sesión que es el estreno de documentales de varios episodios de las 5 puntas de la estrella sobre el legado de Fidel Castro. Si ya no pueden más, si están muy cansados, eso se consigue en YouTube fácilmente, así que no hay problema. También tengo que anunciar 2 cosas. So, just to say in English. I don't know if I need to say it in English. No hace falta, mirando los nombres. Abel Prieto va a contestar las preguntas de ayer y los comentarios y me van a mandar un video hoy. Estarán despertándose, son las 8 de la mañana en La Habana, entonces pronto me llegará un video que puedo compartir con ustedes y también entrará en la grabación. Hoy hay una persona que está enferma. Adrián, en esta sesión, la primera sesión, Adrián Ludet Arévalo Salazar de la Universidad de Holguín no se encuentra bien hoy, pero me ha dado su ponencia para leerla. ¿Okay? Yo creo que lo que vamos a hacer es empezar con María, pasar a Arturo y terminar con Adrián. Porque si nos falte tiempo, por lo menos es una ponencia leída que después también puedo compartir con ustedes si quieren la versión escrita. Bien. Si quieren apuntarlo, mañana también tenemos una persona que no puede participar en la sesión 10. Emily Morris está enferma también. Por razones personales no puede dar su ponencia, entonces tendremos un descanso un poco más largo. Pero todo eso lo repito mañana también. ¿Alguna otra cosa? Yo creo que eso.
No, está bien.
Perfecto. Entonces, buenos días a todos. Tenemos el gran placer de ahora tener un panel compuesto por 2 personas muy queridas por nosotros. María Reyes Baztán, antiguamente de la Universidad de Warwick, bueno, todavía de la Universidad de Warwick, también de la Universidad de Nottingham. Ustedes, a lo mejor, algunos de ustedes reconocen el nombre de María porque ella fue... Buenos días. Ella fue la directora del centro durante un semestre. Entonces, ella era la que les mandaba correos. Seguro que se acuerdan de su nombre. Ha hecho un trabajo maravilloso en nuestro centro y ahora está trabajando en la Universidad de Reading. Y después viene Arturo Hernández, también otra persona muy querida por nosotros, estudiante de posgrado, que ha hecho un trabajo de maravilla en el Hennessy Collection, en el archivo cubano, entre otras cosas. Entonces, estamos muy contentos de tener este panel. Es una pena que no pueda estar Adrián desde Holguín, pero yo voy a leer su ponencia. Entonces, sin más demoras, vamos a empezar con María. Cuando estés lista, María. Gracias. Yo te confirmo que se pueda ver cuando compartes pantalla.
Vale. Para una cosa, he hecho la ponencia en inglés, pero me he dado cuenta. ¿Puedo intentar improvisar o...?
Lo que te venga mejor, ¿eh? Puede ser en inglés perfectamente, lo que te venga mejor.
Vale.
No es para
Igual
que...
hago en inglés, sí, pero luego cualquier pregunta, cualquier comentario,
Okay, let's do
cualquier
it in English.
clarificación.
Sí, cómo no.
Fine, that's fine.
Vale. ¿Esto lo veis?
Sí.
Vale, muy bien. Pues empiezo ya. Vale, bueno, pues hola a todos. Muchas gracias por tenerme aquí. Muchas gracias, Par y Tony, por la presentación también. Como ya ha dicho Par, bueno, antes estaba en la Universidad de Nottingham, pero técnicamente ahora también lo estoy como Honorary Research Fellow. Y también ahora he empezado en la Universidad de Reading y aquí estoy en el despacho de Par. Bueno, muchas gracias, como acabo de decir, por tenerme. Es un gran placer. Y hoy voy a presentaros algo que nunca he presentado, pero que espero que os guste. Igual es un poco diferente de lo que se ha presentado aquí, porque el foco es un poco más en el nacionalismo vasco, pero siempre teniendo en cuenta el nacionalismo cubano. Lo que voy a presentar es una parte de mi doctorado que exploró el uso y la apropiación del lenguaje anticolonial en el nacionalismo vasco. Pero bueno, esta parte está dedicada, como he dicho, a Cuba. Esto es un trabajo en progreso, como podríamos decir, y entonces cualquier comentario, cualquier cosa, al final me vendría genial porque es algo que con lo que quiero continuar trabajando. Bueno, voy a empezar hablando ya un poco medio en inglés y medio en español. Primero, ¿por qué no voy a decir esto en castellano? Esto, para los que no lo sepan, es Euskadi, no la comunidad autónoma del País Vasco, sino el territorio reclamado como nacionalista por los nacionalistas vascos. Como veis, es un territorio que ocupa tanto parte de Francia como parte de España. Mi trabajo se centra en la parte española del País Vasco. Y bueno, vais a ver, veis aquí el nombre de Vizcaya. Vizcaya es importante señalarlo porque el fundador del nacionalismo vasco hablaba de Vizcaya más que del País Vasco. ¿Por qué nos interesa esto? Ahora ya me paso al inglés. Because there's a long history of entanglements and influences between Cuba and Euskadi. I'll be referring to the Basque country as Euskadi, that goes back to the colonization of the island. But what is more important, and what would be the kind of focus of this paper, is that these entanglements become even tighter in the late 19th century, when Cuba's struggle for independence turned into an example to follow for the incipient Basque nationalist movement. The Basque nationalist movement, which again emerged in this area of North Spain, advocated for the independence of the Basque country from Spain. And whilst Cuba's possible independence caused many anxieties in Madrid, Basque nationalists observed Cuba with a sense of hope, because both Cubans and Basques, or at least that's what Basque nationalists believed, shared the same enemy, Spain, and the same oppression, a colonial oppression. And this kind of apparent similarity was key for Basques to view Euskadi as an invaded and occupied nation, akin or similar to Cuba. So what am I going to do in this paper? I'm going to focus on the attitudes that early Basque nationalists had towards Cuba through the case study of the writings of the founder of Basque nationalism, Sabino Arana. He is my guide. He is a big focus of my research. Sabino Arana produced most of his work in the last decade of the 19th century, when, again, Spain was fighting desperately for the control of its last colonies, of course, including Cuba. And he, as I just said, compared the Basque situation, to that of Cuba, and wrote different texts, which at first glance seemed to support Cuban separatists. His text kind of supporting Cubans and in general, his text in general have generated many disagreements. There's kind of two views. The first one, was he actually an anti-colonial figure with a kind of support to
Sorry, Maria, can I just interrupt for a second? Anybody who's got their microphone on, could you just make sure you've switched it off, because there's quite a lot of background noise and we can't hear Maria too well. That would be great. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's all right.
That's it. I think we have a full house of switched off microphones. Over to you again.
Perfect. So was he actually an anti-colonial figure, again, with similar thought to José Martí, which, again, as we will see, he's been compared with? Or was he actually just an anti-Spanish figure with similar thought to Simón Bolívar? So what I try to do, both in my thesis and in this paper, is to provide new evidence that emphasizes the purely anti-Spanish nature of early Basque nationalism, and obviously through the case study of Cuba. And what I hope this research allows us to do is first to trace this usually overlooked transmission of ideas that took place from Latin America to the West, in this case, the idea that the Basque country was a colony. Oh, there's a bit of background noise still. Is that my mum? I suspect maybe it's my mum. Pa, do you know who that is?
And I can try and mute your mum. I feel a little bit bad about doing that, but I can try and mute your mother.
No, it's not her, actually. I can see it now.
Could you all just make sure you've got your microphones switched off? I think it's people who are joining. Maybe I'll just put it in the chat so we don't have to keep interrupting you. Back to you. And it's not your mother.
Sorry, perdón, Mama. So is this, again, what I'm trying to do is to trace this transmission of ideas that took place from Latin America to the West. We can talk a bit more detail later on, and also to understand further the paternalistic ideas the Western nationalist movement had towards Latin America in the late 19th century. We will see that with a bit more detail. Okay, so again, just a short introduction. The Basque nation owes most of his work to one man, Sabino Arana. He did all sorts of things. He created the national anthem, the flag, but also he compiled this ideology for independence in Spain. And he produced his work at the same time than José Martí, with whom he has been often compared. For example, here's a comparison that in 1933, a Basque nationalist leader wrote. He said that Martí gave to Cuba, as Arana Goiri to Euskadi, his apostolic faith, his free and creative spirit, his work, and his own life. Martí felt under the bullets from a Spanish firing squad, and Arana Goiri left prison to die. Martí and Arana Goiri were essayists and poets, organizers of social groups and leaders of the masses. But as I try to prove in this research, again, Martí and Sabino Arana had, however, little in common. These comparisons with José Martí and Cuba, so with the situation of the Basque Country and Euskadi, simply proved powerful to mobilize the incipient Basque nationalist movement, because according to Sabino Arana, the Basque Country was not a region of Spain, such as Galicia or Catalonia, but instead, again, it was a colony of Spain, very similar to Cuba, very similar to the Philippines. This is present in many, many of his texts, but we can see an example here. He said, in this century, in which so many Spanish colonies were emancipated from its metropolis, and you, Biscay, remember that he talked about Biscay rather than the Basque Country at the beginning, had to be subjected by this same nation, Spain, obviously. You, Biscay, who never suffered the foreign yoke, you who have always been a free nation. So again, this plays with the idea that the Basque Country was a free nation until it was colonized by the Spanish in a time in which so many Spanish colonies in Latin America were emancipated. And again, Cuba proved to be the perfect colonial analogy. Through this comparison, this colonial analogy, as I was saying, what this meant is that Basque independence was presented as a logical step. In other words, if the Cubans were to be free, the Basques could do the same. So let's see a little bit more of Arana's thought. So this belief that the Basques were involved in a colonial conflict against independence, or against colonialism, made Sabino Arana sympathize with other colonial insurgents of the time, again, including Morocco, the Philippines, and of course, Cuba. But again, was he really driven by a genuine hatred for colonialism, or was he only interested in colonial emancipation if this was to affect Spain internally? Well, let's look at some examples in which we actually can see this. So, for example, in 1894, he wrote, "We can only look at Cuba's separatism as a foreign question, which does not affect our homeland at all, and we don't care at all if the Cubans triumph. It will only affect us insofar as it can influence the international situation, internal situation of Spain." Right? So we see here the idea that they only care about Cuba if Cuba can affect Spain's internal situation. And then it says, as our triumph will be closer once Spain becomes more prostrated and ruined. What economic consequences can follow the separation of Cuba and Spain? Perhaps it is not a loss, but an improvement of its Spanish treasure, as it seems like its colonial expenses are higher than its income. Again, Sabino Arana here was obviously aware of the situation of Spain in Cuba in its last years of imperial rule. So, of course, again, passages like this confirm that Sabino Arana was not so interested in the freedom of the Cubans, but instead Cuban independence would only be welcomed by the Basques if this was to affect Spain internally. He stressed a similar idea in the same text. He says, if there was an armed conflict for Cuba's independence between Cuba and its metropolis, then the question will be different. But today, and I can't see, but I think it says something, the peaceful separation of Cuba can bring any good to Biscay. Now, naturally, when in 1895, Cuban revolutionaries turned to violence, Sabino Arana became more sympathetic towards Cuban rebels because he thought this could now affect Spain internally. In 1895, he even informed his readers of a rumor about a group of Basque nationalists going to Cuba to fight in José Martí's army against the Spanish. And of course, from 1895 to 1898, Sabino Arana followed the events in both Cuba and the Philippines and wrote about them regularly. Again, he was indeed aware of what the end of the Spanish Empire will have enormous consequences for Spain. So he wrote, for example, without treasure, without patriotism in its leader, without faith in its subjects, without morality, discipline, sources of wealth, hard work, culture, and civilization. Again, a very interesting use of words. Decadent Spain is the most backwards nation of Europe, is the laughing stock of the world. So again, he knew, and this is why he supported the Cubans, that if Spain lost colonies, then Spain would become the laughing stock of the world. When in 1898, Spain lost its last colonies, of course, Spain was involved now in the biggest national crisis than Sabino Arana could have dreamed of. And for example, 1898, as most of you will know, is known in Spain as El Desastre del 98, the 98 disaster, because this confirmed the idea that had been present in European intellectual discourses since the mid-17th century, and again, that Arana was so aware of, that Spain had transitioned from a great European power to a second-class nation. So when this happens, after 1898, Sabino Arana takes the opportunity to praise the American administration and to compare Spain, which he perceived as an inferior nation whose national crisis post-98 was seen as the product, and this is his words, of pain provoked by themselves, punishment for past crimes, end of quote, to the US, which he perceived as a virtuous nation. And again, here we can kind of tell what he actually thought about Cuba. So let's see some of these contrasts that he made, or some of the words that he used to talk about the US. So, for example, in 1899, Arana argued that Guipúzcoa, Álava, and Biscay, the three Basque provinces, which were independent states, became Spanish dominions and actual Spanish provinces, just as Cuba and the Philippines were after the very same Spanish nation conquered them up until last year, thanks to the US protection. They emancipated from Spain. So again, he starts projecting the image of the US as a savior. In another article, he repeats exactly the sort of same idea when arguing that Cuba and the Philippines were Spanish provinces until last year, when protected by the United States, they were emancipated. Another article, more examples, there's plenty, but he commented how the US had followed, quote, humanitarian procedures in its intervention in both Cuba and the Philippines. Sabino Arana died in 1903, so kind of, you know, he probably was aware that the procedures were not very humanitarian. So again, what we see is how Sabino Arana reproduced this Western idea about how the virtue and the civilization of Western countries, such as the US, entitle it to colonize or intervene in foreign countries, especially in Latin America, where anarchy, obviously, a quote, governed. We can see, I always observe his words as a big parallel of kind of US propaganda to intervene in Cuba, in this case, this very famous image in 1898. And in this kind of period, again, we see how these ideas of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism against sort of Latin countries begin to echo in Sabino Arana's thought. So, for example, according to him, the difference between the practice carried out by the US, racial brothers, this is what he said in quotes, and the Spanish had long-lasting effects, as evidenced by the difference between North and South America. Here's something that he said about this. He said, "We don't know what certain races have in their blood, that when they touch other, it degenerates them and prostitutes itself. Whereas in the United States of America, science accomplishes such a surprising degree of progress, Latin America closes the door to progress and opens it widely to every vice." Again, we can talk about these sorts of ideas later with more detail if you wish. And Arana argued that what happened to all these nations that have been infected by the Latin races, in this case, the Spanish, is also happening to us, the Basques. Now, again, reinforcing this idea of a colonial analogy between Latin America and the Basque country. So again, with what we see here is that he seemed to believe that under the protection and sovereignty of Spain's antithesis, which was the US, according to him, new independent nations such as Cuba were to grow and progress. Perhaps the kind of more obvious example, and I'll finish very, very soon, is that in 1902, before his death, he sent a telegram to US President Theodore Roosevelt, congratulating him for freeing Cuba from Spanish rule. And we can see, again, the kind of wording that he used when he refers to the US as extremely noble federation, and also about how thanking the US to free Cuba from slavery. He also, again, says that the US is an example of greatness and called justice and freedom, and also inimitable for European powers, particularly those that are of Latin origin. He uses those words. This telegram has been interpreted sort of differently amongst scholars. There's a group that have used it to argue that Sabino Arana's anti-colonialism was indeed selective and targeted at Spain's alone. Again, it was strategic. It was just a strategy to kind of defeat Spain's prestige and also to advocate for independence. But others have said that the Basque leader believed that in 1902, Cuba was to achieve full independence. And the evidence to sustain this view has been based on the fact that during his trial in November 1902, he went to trial for this and was actually imprisoned. He was asked to clarify what he meant by Cuba being freed from slavery. And he claimed that he wanted to, and I quote, manifest his joy for the freedom of the Grande Antilla, here Cuba, from the slavery he had been subjected to and since then had suffered. However, as we have seen, the telegram was not an isolated event, and all these ideas that we've seen were present in his thought. So just to conclude, is obviously that Sabino Arana did not consider being under Spanish dominion the same as being under North American control, and it's clear that in his eyes, the US practiced a sort of benign or good form of colonialism, which followed the values of freedom and justice. It is also obvious that, as we've seen, Sabino Arana was not particularly interested in the freedom of the Cubans unless this was to affect Spain internally. Of course, as well, Sabino Arana's views implied a highly paternalistic view of the colonized, in this case, the Cubans, whose years of struggle against Spain were not even acknowledged. He just simply thanked the US for kind of, obviously, within commas, freeing the Cubans. And just as a conclusion, what I plan to do in the future is kind of shift the focus of my research and focus on the attitudes on race and colonialism held not only by Basques, but also by Catalan and Galician in Cuba in the years preceding the end of the Spanish Empire. So that is me. I hope that was not too boring. I think I've stopped.
You have. Thank you, Maria. It was not boring at all. That was great.
Perfectly timed, perfectly delivered. Thank you very much.
However, something happened maybe only to us, which is when Jonathan, hello, Jonathan, when you joined, you started sharing your screen. So could we ask you just to press the red telephone, leave the room, and come back in again, and then we maybe see Maria? I don't know if it's just me, but all I can see is Jonathan's screen. So we stopped seeing your PowerPoint in the last slide, Maria.
Oh,
Okay.
well, at least
Maybe
we
that
can
was
hear
just
now.
us. There we go. We see you again.
Yep.
Hopefully that'll be fine. And when Jonathan comes back, it'll be fine. Not at all boring, beautifully timed, and really fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Some of the people who do the applause can do the applause. There it is. I can learn how to do it. There we go. It's important that we have the applause.
No pressure. There's no need to.
There you go.
Thank you.
Excellent. So we'll leave the questions till the end, if that's okay. And we will move on then to Arturo Hernández. Great, Arturo, here he is. Everybody make sure your mics are off. And let's see if Arturo can share the screen. Tony, do you want to introduce Arturo?
Well, I can introduce him, certainly. A brilliant postgrad at the moment. Coming
brilliant at the moment.
Coming close to finishing the PhD, and such really interesting topic that Arturo's been looking at, and this is part of the work he's doing. And I will say no more because Arturo can tell you about himself a lot more.
Thank you, Tony. Bueno, como María, yo preparé esta presentación en inglés, pero para formar como una introducción, como dijo Tony, me llamo Arturo Hernández y estoy en el centro y trabajo con Par y Tony. Tony es mi supervisor y mi tesis es sobre el derecho constitucional en Cuba desde el año 1808 hasta el 2019, ¿no? Entre eso, las ideas que corren desde el principio del constitucionalismo cubano, desde el principio hasta el final. Quiere decir, ¿qué es lo que hay en común entre 200 años básicamente de constitucionalismo cubano, ¿no? Este papel específicamente toca en las constituciones cubanas de la guerra, quiere decir, de Guaymiro hasta la constitución del 95 antes de la independencia cubana. Otra vez, perdón porque yo voy a tener que hablar en inglés en esta presentación, pero muchas gracias por tenerme y muchas gracias por tener la oportunidad de estar aquí con ustedes. Okay, so insofar as my research goes, there's a couple points that I wanted to highlight from the beginning, and I'm going to try to make this quick because I have the tendency to overspeak, right? If I'm given the opportunity to speak too much. So first, a couple points that I'd like to make. Cuba's Constitution of 69, which is Guaymiro, right, represents the first organically Cuban constitution. That is the first constitution implemented in Cuba, created by Cubans, for Cubans, an independent constitutionalism, as opposed to the constitutions that preceded them, which were very much the product of Spanish creation, right? So you see Cádiz, the Constitution of 1812 in Cádiz, right, is a good example of that. The kind of reinstitution of Cádiz in 1823 is also an example of that, right? And then obviously you have the imposition of in 1837, you have the imposition of what they call special laws, which were essentially martial law implemented on the colonies, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines, right? So Guaymiro 68 represents the kind of the idea of organic Cuban constitutionalism. Now, with that in mind, it's essential to keep in mind that constitution and the subsequent constitution of 78 and then also of 95 and 97 are militaristic constitutions, right? So they're not civil constitutions like, for example, the American Constitution, which was created and enacted after its independence period, right? So it's essential to keep in mind that despite the fact that it is Cuba's first these are Cuba's first experiences with constitutionalism, they kind of paint a distorted picture in that they're created and established during periods of warfare, right? Revolutionary warfare against the mother country, right? Another thing to keep in mind, importantly, is that these constitutions established the first independent Cuban governments, right? So whereas prior to that, they were obviously ruled by Spain as a colony, and more specifically by captain generals in a sort of militaristic martial law kind of situation, right? These constitutions formed the first independent government, which of course again needs to be qualified by the fact that they were militaristic governments as opposed to purely civil governments. But that's part of the dynamic which later plays into the main argument of this paper, which is namely the disunity that existed within the constitutional parties with regard to militarism. That is, control of the military and control of the government by either the legislative branch or the executive branch, right? So that militarism plays into, in a huge way, plays into the disunity that would later come as a result of these constitutions. And at the last big point that I want to mention is that this is the first, the Cuba's wartime constitutions represent the first manifestation of separatism, right? So prior to what they call the separatist movement, so prior to the institution of these constitutions, there was many fundamental ideas that formed the basis of different constitutional movements within Cuba. The first one and most notable one, obviously, is kind of the decentralized reformism, right? So during Cádiz, for example, the American colonies wanted not to separate from Spain, but rather to become autonomous, to have more autonomy, to create their own laws that functioned as within their countries. But there wasn't really an intention to split from Spain. So that represents kind of the autonomous tradition, right? And you could see that the kind of pushes for autonomy in 1812 in Cádiz. And then, and also the efforts at decentralization in 1823 from 1820 to 1823 with the reinstitution of the liberal triennium, right? That movement kind of comes to an end following the imposition of the special laws, as I mentioned, from 1837 onwards, right? Not that it disappears, because autonomism exists all the way until 1898, till Cuba establishes independence. But it loses steam in a huge way from 1837 onwards, simply because Cubans come to understand that even the most liberal Spanish governments are not going to permit Cuba to kind of be autonomous, right? And so then after that, you have the second movement that kind of manifests itself within Cuban constitutionalism, which is that of annexationism, right? And that's the movement amongst a certain intellectual class to unite itself legally with the United States, become part of the United States, and separate from Spain in that manner, right? And this movement takes off from 1837 onwards in a bigger way, right? Namely because of the issue of slavery, right? So that at that point in time, the American colonies are still practice slavery, some particularly in the South, most of them in the South. And so there's this desire amongst the Cuban slave-owning class to ally itself with the southern states of the United States so as to allow the status quo to continue, right? There were international considerations that played into that. For example, the push from England and the United Kingdom to abolish the transatlantic slave trade kind of pushed the Cubans to want to cast their lot with the Americans as opposed to the Spanish, simply because they were aware of the international considerations that Spain would have to accommodate in order to continue existing in Europe, right? So there was that annexationist push, which nonetheless came to an end in a big way following the American Civil War and obviously the abolition of slavery in the United States, right? So it became less appealing, right? Nonetheless, there were movements, big movements, insurrectionary movements that meant to effectuate that kind of annexationist constitutionalism, namely the movement in 1851 with Narciso Lopez, right? So Narciso Lopez instituted a constitution in the annexationist kind of realm that was meant to facilitate the transfer of Cuba from Spain to the United States, right? And then lastly, we have, again, that separatist constitutionalism that whereby the ideas of independence, Cuba operating as an independent nation, has finally crystallized into a constitutional movement that establishes an independent Cuban government. And that's what we see with the establishment of Guaymiro in 1869, right? The ultimate goal, of course, as I've been mentioning, of this movement was to establish an independent Cuba, right? And insofar as the ultimate goal is concerned, there's unity, right? There's unity amongst the parties, there's unity amongst the players, the military, and the different thinkers that form part of this constitutional movement in 1869, right? There is the main theme to this entire paper, however, is despite what I just mentioned, is the disunity of the parties, right? And so while the ultimate goal was to get rid of Spain essentially and secure independence, there was disunity with regards to how we were going to achieve that goal, right? And that kind of that's the main thread that runs through the wartime constitutions from 68 all the way to 95, and amongst Cuba's biggest players, as we're going to see, right? So it starts off as a kind of a dispute between people like Céspedes, right, which kind of wanted greater centralized control of the military, and people like Agramonte, right, which wanted more civil control or legislative control over the military. So that becomes the big issue, right? From a political perspective, this dynamic that I just mentioned has been characterized as either the conflict between civilism and militarism, right? And there's a certain truth to that. Nonetheless, I think it kind of from a constitutional perspective, it's more of a dynamic as between legislative and executive control over military actions. And I say that because the civil government, or the quote civil government that was operating following the creation of these constitutions, was very militaristic in its nature, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, right? So despite the fact that it was a civil government, it nonetheless, its main purpose was to effectuate a military revolution. And in that manner, it wasn't a civil government per se, right? So the characterization of this idea between legislative civilism and militaristic executive action, right, is kind of misleading. Nonetheless, that's the way that it's been portrayed in the literature, right? At the fundamental root of this dichotomy, right, constitutionally speaking, it's a separation or a kind of dispute between legislative supremacy and executive supremacy, right? And there's something that plays into this later is a racial component, and if I have enough time, I'll describe it at the end of the presentation. But yeah, so it's this dynamic between legislative or executive supremacy. So in Guaymiro in 69, you have the creation of a government that's very weighted toward the legislative branches, right? So you have the legislative branch could appoint the president at will. It could remove the president at will. It creates the assembly. It could create and destroy the vice presidency, the presidency of the Cámara. And so you have this institution with an extreme amount of government power, so a huge concentration of power in the legislative, right? This comes to form a significant problem for the running of military operations for Céspedes, right? And the biggest problem that he is going to face, and that the regime created by this constitution is going to face, is that the military situation is going to prevent the legislature from meeting. And when this happens, because the power of government is concentrated within the legislature, the executive is going to be either going to have to co-opt power that doesn't constitutionally belong to him, or he's going to have to just let the government play out as it does, and the revolution would, at that part, would fall apart at that juncture. And so Céspedes, what he does is essentially co-ops the government power that he doesn't have in order to keep the revolution going, right? Because the legislative branches are unable to meet. Nonetheless, when the legislative branches could meet once again, they view this action by Céspedes as attributing to himself powers that he doesn't have constitutionally. And this causes a conflict between Céspedes, the executive, right, the chief of the military, and the supreme legislature, which subsequently leads to them deposing Céspedes from the executive branch, right? He's killed shortly thereafter. Agramonte and several other big players are killed, and this kind of dynamic between the executive and the legislature continue to hamper the development of the Cuban government throughout the entire 9 years of the war until 1878, right? At which point the Treaty of San Juan essentially puts an end to the war for the most part. And so that's the big issue, right? But coming out of this of the 10 years war from 1868 to 1878, you have this legacy of inefficiency due to the extreme legislative supremacy and the lack of power from the executive, and this kind of issue of combativeness as between the executive and the legislative, right? This issue later comes to manifest itself within the players of the 1895 and the 1895 Constitution, right? Namely, the two big players here are Antonio Maceo and Jose Marti, right? So Jose Marti represents the kind of the idealism, the civilism that was previously represented by Agramonte, namely the government, despite the fact that we're at war, the government needs to be run by a civil legislative branch, and the executive has to respond to that civil government despite the inefficiency, right? And then you have on the other side Maceo, which represents the ideology that all these ideas and all this kind of academic kind of nature that goes into creating these civil governments are all good and fine. Nonetheless, we're at war. We need centralized command, right? And because of that, now we need a more centralized militaristic executive, favorable executive regime, right? And so that leads to problems as between Maceo and Marti, and also amongst their supporters and their followers, right? Should the government of Cuba be more civilistic, right? Or that is to say, should the legislature take supreme, or should it be more militaristic? That is, should the executive have more power over what happens in Cuba? And that comes to a head right before the beginning of the 1895 revolution, where Martí and Maceo meet with Gómez, Máximo Gómez in La de Majagua, and that leads to a dispute that subsequently gets resolved because Jose Martí gets killed shortly thereafter, and Antonio Maceo kind of concedes to a more civilized government, a more civil legislative supreme government, in light of the circumstances, right? In order to get the 1895 revolution off the ground. Nonetheless, that dynamic between executive and legislative continues to hamper the military operations in Cuba, and to a certain extent make what happens afterwards with the imposition of the Platt Amendment more likely, in that there was a more civil government in control that was more willing to sit and listen to whatever the Americans wanted to say or impose, as opposed to perhaps more centralized command under one person or an executive group of people. that would make decisions on behalf of kind of the militaristic branch of the revolution, right? And so that's basically the thread that runs through all of Cuba's wartime constitutions, as quickly as I could possibly put it. Real quick, the racial component that I mentioned earlier comes into play because of the composition of the Cuban Revolutionary Army, right? So you have a very large amount of the majority of the Cuban Revolutionary Army is black, right? Whereas the majority of the quote unquote civil government happens to be middle class whites. And so that dynamic in between quote unquote civil control and executive control, as the War of 1895 continues to play out, starts to appear more like a dispute between the black Cuban vision of republicanism and the elite intellectual vision of republicanism. And so that obviously continues to color the dispute. And so that's the racial component to that. But that's basically it as fast as I could possibly present it. So thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, just let me know.
Many thanks, Arturo, and well done on keeping to 20 minutes. So your warning was unnecessary. I think what we're going to do now, Par is suggested, and I think it's right, that before she reads Adrián's paper, we could take the questions on the first two papers, because we've got the two people here to answer them. So I think what we should do is take up to 20 minutes or so to do that. So over to you, anybody in the audience who's got questions or comments.
So I can see, thank you both. I can see that Enrique Sacerio Gari, hello Enrique, has a question. So please go ahead. Adelante,
Yeah,
Enrique, en español o inglés.
I'm sorry, I think I pressed the wrong button.
Okay.
But I really enjoyed the presentation, and
Thank you.
but I don't have a question.
No problem at all.
My God.
It's easily done. Questions, comments?
Can I come in with a question, please? Or it's not as much a question, it's an observation, I think, for you, Maria. It is, I was fascinated by what you presented as quite clearly racist concepts coming out of the leader of the independence movement, which surprised me, except it reminded me also of parallels with the Welsh nationalism and Irish nationalism at the same time, when the intellectuals first putting together the thoughts behind that movement were quite clearly influenced by racist concepts one way or another. So there might be an interesting parallel there. That was all, no more than that.
Thank you, Tony. No, do you know, I actually, one of my biggest topics in the thesis, I look at anti-colonialism, but then it's violence and race. I left out race, but it's fascinating, and that's something that we can discuss another time, how race is such an important part of the nationalist movement, and how when they talk about international struggles and they want to kind of position themselves in a position of solidarity, and so, for example, when they talk about India, when they talk about Egypt or whatever, they sort of decry racism. They are anti-racist. However, when they talk about Spain, they produce very strong racist comments. And kind of one of my theses or one of my arguments in my book is as well that we need to pay attention to those sort of patronizing comments as well that kind of are hidden, and a lot of people haven't talked about them, but they're certainly there when Basques talk about kind of extra-European nations. There are always these discourses of race. And the parallel with the Welsh, that's something I'll be really interested to look at. I know about the parallel with the Irish, as that's something I talk quite a lot, but I didn't know about the Welsh. So I will certainly look. Is there any specific nationalist group?
I just cannot remember the name of the person who started it off. He's the person who is quite clearly seen widely as the historic originator of nationalist thinking. And of course, the Welsh nationalists of today would almost certainly reject that link, but the link was there clearly, and it does remind me of the early Irish thinking of the same time. So
perfect, thank you. I'll definitely look into that.
Okay, we have a question from Helen Yaff. Hello, Helen, and then from Sarah Simpson. Go ahead, Helen.
Hi, thanks for two very interesting talks. Question for Arturo. You just brought into your presentation towards the end the racial component of the different interests that clash between the civilian and the military. I wondered if you could address more specifically the economic component. What were their sort of class interests a bit more? What sectors were they coming from as plantation owners or artisans or whatever? If you could just, because obviously race and class are very linked, just a little bit more about the economic basis of their kind of interests.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Helen. As suspected, right, there is this link between economic and social class and race, right, and it manifests itself within the dynamic that I just explained, very much along racial lines. So it's clearly distinguishable, right? So, for example, because the poor and quote unquote lower classes of society formed a major part of the Revolutionary Army, they tended towards what was then called militarism, right? Which is centralization of executive power under military commanders, right? So you see the kind of the lower economic classes align with that simply because they make up a majority of the Revolutionary Army, and because that allows them to exercise more control over what's happening on the ground, right? On the flip side of that, you have the intellectual kind of class, which obviously the educated class, the well-to-do, the formally educated class, the well-to-do class, the class of people that own plantations and so on and so forth, right? And so naturally, because of their formal education, right, they tend to be idealistic. They don't tend to be, for the most part, the military commanders that are really out there. There are some exceptions, but that are going out there and really putting themselves on the line, right? And so they tend to fall into that kind of civilist control, right? And there's racism and classism that plays into that. Namely, we are better suited to make decisions on behalf of the Cuban government than you are, despite the fact that you being the quote unquote militaristic class, right? Despite the fact that they were out there actually making Cuban independence happen, right? This idea that we as a class, because of our class superiority or perceived racial superiority, are in a better position to determine the kind of direction of the Cuban government. So yeah, the economic classes definitely play a part, and they definitely fall in line within the divisions that you would expect them to traditionally. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Question.
Over to Sarah.
Hi, thanks to both of you. It's good to see you, and it's nice to see you present your work, because obviously we've talked about it informally, but yeah, thanks very much. I have another question about race. Seems to be a theme, and this one is for Maria again. So I was really interested to hear you talking about the whole kind of like Latin Anglo-Saxon races thing. That's something I'm reading a lot about at the moment, because I'm reading a lot about Puerto Rico right now. And I was just wondering, how did Arana and Basque nationalists consider their own race? Did they not consider themselves Latins? What was their... Oh, sorry, my cat's crazy. Yeah, anyway, that's my question. Here she is.
Oh, fantastic, Sarah. Getting heckled by your own cat. There's nothing.
She's always like, when I was doing my whip, she kept biting my feet.
Oh, that's so funny. Hi, Sarah. Nice to see you after a long time. Nice to see your cat as well. thank you for that question, because that's something that, you know, when I was planning to give this talk, apart from the map, I was like, should I explain the question of race? And that's like something that is very, very relevant to explain. No, they did not consider their own race as Latin. They kind of Basque people, and that, of course, now that's something that you know, Basque nationalists don't believe at all. But for the period of my research, so late 19th century up until 1936, they believe that they were a unique race. I can send you different things. They consider they were a unique race whose kind of origin was unknown. Some people claim that it was the Middle East, but sometimes also they claim they were really writing according a lot of theories of race that were developed in the 19th century. So some of them also said that they came from India, but the main kind of like difference was that they were the oldest race of Europe. That was the oldest race of the world. And one of the things that I look in my research is how that was associated with whiteness, because you can really tell that you know, whiteness was something that kind of distinguished them, or something that they wanted to be different. When they talked about the Latin races, they used very, very like racist language that they appropriated from sort of anthropology of the 19th century. So they would say that the Latin race was dirty, the Latin race was contaminated, it was not pure like the Basque. It was just a mixture of races, in contrast of the Basques, and then in contrast later on, after 1898 actually, of the states of the Anglo-Saxon races. So it's a very, very interesting topic. I'm very happy to send you some more literature if you're saying that that's appearing in your research as well, that distinction between Latin and Anglo-Saxon races.
Yeah, I'd love to read that. That's a really fascinating concept, that they're a unique race. So yeah, thanks very much for that.
No worries. Thank you.
And congratulations on your new post.
Oh, thank you.
And Arturo, your hands up.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of piggyback off that, Sarah, and it kind of it plays into what you were just talking about and what Maria was talking about, right? Despite the fact that there was the existence within Cuba of that dynamic between the white group, right, and the Afro-Cubans, when dealing with the Americans, the white Cubans quickly find out, much to their chagrin, right, that they are not considered white by the Anglo-Americans, and so that issue of race kind of it comes back to haunt the white Cubans, right, and it plays into what Maria was talking about, right, like these ideas of Anglo-Saxon, you know, quoted superiority or whatnot, and so I think that ties it back to Cuba. Just a quick kind of segue into that.
Paul has a question.
I have a question, Maria. So how, you know, the idea of the US as the savior protector, it's a pretty strong idea at that time for people who are based in Europe, at least if they don't consider themselves to be Latin. How is that incorporated into the narrative of nationalism in the 20th century from the 1950s onwards? Or is that just completely disregarded? Is that just written out of the roots of nationalism in the Basque Country?
Thank you, Pat. Do you mean if that idea of British or Anglo-Saxon,
yes,
does it disappear, do you mean, or?
Does it disappear? Does it survive? Is it ignored? Is it incorporated? Is it transformed?
That is something that again, I deal with quite a lot in my own research. It only disappears. So there's two main branches in the Basque nationalist movement. There's the pro-autonomous branch, which wanted autonomy, of course, and then the radical that wanted independence. Those two branches stayed together until 1921. And whereas the moderate branch continues developing these ideas that I call ideas of good colonialism, which fits within mainly the British. They're always like, the British are the best, you know, the colonialism could be justified because they are just so amazing. the radicals start actually condemning the British and applying, and starting conceiving colonialism as something inherently evil, depending of who's the colonizer, regardless who's the colonizer, after 1916. And that is because of the Easter Rising in Ireland, because they start considering the British as actually, they're not that good. There's been a rebellion, there's been a violent one. Maybe we should be like the Irish. So only the radical branch, again, starts condemning colonialism at all levels after 1916. The moderate branch kind of continues, and even in the 50s, we see when they talk about Kenya, when they talk about India, when they talk about different movements around the world, it's still the idea of British colonialism is better because of the race kind of continues still in the movement. I'm not too sure when it disappears from the moderates, because my research finished in 1936, but that would be something interesting to see. I hope that responds to your question.
Absolutely, it does. Thank you. Really interesting. Both papers are really interesting and they're really nice.